Hi everyone. So I hope you've gone okay with the narrative lesson. We're going to think about representation now. So we're going to think about representation of
Hi everyone.
of men and women,
And
how that might reflect the era that the films were made in. So, for example, with Invasion of the Body Snatchers, you're going to be thinking about the representation of men and women and how that relates to the 1950s context. So I want you to particularly think about Becky. If you recall, Becky, when she first starts off in the film, it said that she's just come back from London. And so that might imply that she's a kind of independent woman, which kind of fits into the context of the 1950s. We've spoken before about how during the Second World War, women took on lots of the roles that men were not able to do because they were away at war. And we've spoken a bit about how kind of after that women went back to these domestic roles, but by the 50s women were more highly educated than they were before. So there's this kind of conflict between women being put in these submissive domestic roles, but they're kind of more intelligent and more capable than that.
excuse me. Wait.
Oh, you've put a hammer there. Also thinking about Miles. So he's a divorce. He's recently divorced from his wife. Divorce rates in the 1950s. Divorce was generally frowned upon, but as we spoke about before, a lot of people got married just before the war because they were worried that their loved ones, that the men might not come back from war. So lots of people got married before the war, and then afterwards the divorce rate was quite high because people came back and they kind of realised that this wasn't the right person to be married to. But nevertheless, divorce was frowned upon in society. So thinking about how Miles is a divorcee, and thinking we've spoken about how Becky is often kind of behind Miles. So thinking about her taking on this kind of submissive role, whereas Miles is taking on this traditional kind of leadership role, and thinking how this maybe fits with ideas of traditional gender roles at the time. Another thing I want you to think about is Becky at the end, when she turns into a pod person, and how men at the time might be threatened by kind of women's desire to become more independent. And obviously this was made in 1956. Feminism was becoming a big thing in the 60s and 70s, but it was kind of emerging in the 1950s. And some men may have seen female independence as being a threat to the social order. So the idea that Becky is a kind of dangerous female might come into the ending of the film. So with E.T., thinking about gender roles, you might want to think about the mother and how she's a single mother. She's a working single mother and she's providing for her children. And that could be seen as quite a positive representation of women. We've got an absent father, so that is a kind of negative representation of men. And as we've spoken about before, E.T. maybe comes in to fulfill that father figure role that is missing from Elliot's life. You can also think about the representation of age. So we saw that character in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the child who Miles kind of dismisses and doesn't listen to. But by the 1980s, the status of children in society was higher, and that's kind of reflected within the representations that we see in E.T. So by putting Elliot and the other children and teenagers as the central characters that kind of says something about how society has changed and the role of children and the importance of children has changed. So whereas in the 50s the idea of children might be that they are to be seen and not heard, by the 1980s children, they take on a more important role in society. And I think this also is a big shift in the target audience. So we spoke in the genre lesson about how family movies were becoming a big thing in the 1980s and how that was a kind of genre of films because that was an emerging audience in the 50s, in the 80s. Okay, so you might also want to think about representation of the alien and how aliens are represented, which we've spoken about in a previous lesson. And you might want to think about representation of authorities and also representation of America. So how America comes across, because both of these films are set obviously in America, in the suburbs, both in California as well. Yeah, anything else we need to think about with regards to representations? So we've got, okay, obviously there's not really any anything to do with race in either of these. So I think that that's important though, because America is a multicultural country, but both of these films, it's just white people. So that's something to consider. And that's probably because the film industry at the time in both the 50s and the 80s was predominantly white, and many of the representations were white. And it's only been in more recent times that family movies and sci-fi has had a lot more diversity to it. So that's something to consider. Okay, so I hope you're all well, hope you're all keeping busy, and I'll see you soon.